So Rose, thank you for welcoming introduction. I have done a talk for the Academy once, and this is my second time. And this is a quite, how should I say, for me it's a reflecting time, having done 17 to 20 years of studies, some of them focused on veterans issues. I would like to start out with saying that throughout the course of my research, we have own casualties, suicide, and those who are killed in action. So this is dedicated to them. So this talk, as you know, was organized by the St. Louis Academy of Science in conjunction with Missouri History Museums between the two worlds. And that's really showing the struggles and some of the videos that we've seen, and there are some exhibit scenes from there. So make sure that if you can't see it tonight, probably, but well, if you haven't seen them, come back and look at this exhibit. And also there is a beautiful photographs of homeless veterans just next to the exhibit for between two walls. And that's almost broke down. It's just a beautiful photograph, so make sure to go there too. All right, so today I am going to be talking about, I'm sorry. So this is my template. When I give a talk in the university, I have to give this out. So this is acknowledgement, and we have been lucky to receive funding from National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute of Drug Abuse, in the Department of Defense, and via Health Services Research, both in the St. Louis and the national headquarters, and at the Washington University, and via Institute for Clinical and Translational Research Sciences. They provided the seed funding for a few times, and the Brown Center for Violence and Injury Prevention, and I don't have any conflict to disclose. So just to move in, the history of a war, human species are the kind of species who just can't get away from wars. So from the antiquity to today, we see history of war all the time. However, today I'm just going to be focusing on the period from the Vietnam to today, because that's where we see major advances in the sciences. I'm not saying that there was no science advancement before that, but we have seen the real flourish of science advancement starting with the Vietnam. So today, mortality is not really an injury, but I feel compelled to show little statistics of the casualties of the war, two wars mainly. And I talk a little bit about suicide and physical injuries. And the remaining portion of the talk is what's called the trauma spectrum disorders, or invisible wound. And those are the disorders that you can't see, but affect your lives very much. And finally, I talk about the reintegration, focusing on Missouri National Guard. Treatment and prevention would be interweaving treatment and the prevention advances for each topic. Disclaimer. Okay, so for those of you who served in Desert Storm, I'm not going to be able to share much about science advancement there, in part because I don't know enough about it, and in part because it was a very short period. And also, this talk is designed for introductory talk for science, prevention, and treatment. So I won't be able to go into too much of a detail about each area. If you are interested in knowing more about it, you can learn from the website, or you can send me an email, and then I can direct you to the right place. So first, what the military used to call casualties, and now they're still called the casualties, but basically we're talking about the deaths of soldiers. And this one is an officer, and then the painting from 1700, this is a Canadian general. All right, so zooming into Vietnam, Now, the Vietnam period officially is from 1955 to 1975. Most people think that's from 1964 to 75, but the data here are from this 55 to 75. So, if you're Vietnam veterans, you probably know this number in your heart, 58 to 86. That's the number of veterans who died. That's the number of names on the wall. So that was a very costly war. I do want to point out though, if you think about the Vietnamese military, both North and the South, their casualty were much more horrendous than what US lost. And this is the magnitude of the war over the 10 years, considering most of the casualty occurred since 1964 to 75. So, compared to that, last 12 years, we have been lucky. I shouldn't say that, but the science has advanced, the technology has advanced, and the public's perception about the deaths changed so much that we have not seen the magnitude of the deaths that we saw in Vietnam. And people who grew up after Vietnam don't remember what it was like. And I was not here actually when the war was fought. I was still in Japan. But I do want you to remember it was one of the most outrageous wars that the US got involved. So over the, since 9/11 to present, so if you tally up the number of deaths, it's about 7,000. I do not know that number. When I started the research on this cohort, OEF, OND, OIF, OND, OEF, that stands for Operation Iraq Freedom, Operation New Dawn, because people just didn't want to say Operation Iraq Freedom because they got out, and Operation Enduring Freedom. Those are three operation names, but it's two wars fought in one period. So going back to the death rate, it's about less than 7,000. That's still too many. And when I was going to say that when I started doing the research on this population, we're counting 300, oh my gosh, 500, oh my gosh, 1,000, oh my gosh. Then the news media stopped reporting the death rate because it's gotten too many. Over 3,000 is more than the deaths for which we started the war for. So this is the magnitude of the casualty. So, so that's the deaths either lost in action, killed in action, or missing in action, and some other war-related deaths. And what about long-term mortality? So here I just wanted to summarize for you. So the war, being a war zone is a major factor. So compared to veterans who were in war zones, in the Vietnam period, the veterans are twice more likely to die from motor vehicle during the first year period, which is a little bit surprising. And yesterday we were doing the interview and Don Marsh said, oh, that's kind of, I did not know that. So the first 5 years, that's a really risk period. But if you look at the next 6 to 14 year period, the risk for dying is only 16% more than the civilian counterpart. I should also pointed out the homicide deaths is also a risk for the veterans coming back from the Vietnam era period. And Gulf, this is one of the few data that I have. Gulf War, 30% more likely to die from motor vehicle accident. That's only less than the first 2 years. And for OIF, OND, OEF veterans in the military personnel, we have a very detailed suicide information, but the long-term mortality, we still don't have the data. So during my earlier study of Vietnam veterans, we had suicide, and so that got me into research on the suicide. So it sort of happened right now, suicide news about the current cohort of service members and the veterans is all over. New York Times, this is an article a couple of weeks ago. During the Vietnam and the Gulf Wars, risk of suicide among Vietnam War veterans and the Gulf War veterans as a whole, research found is not significantly higher than the non-deployed veterans or comparable U.S. general populations. Why could that be? You know, you hear a lot about the suicide during the Vietnam period, during the Gulf, and more so now. And that's because, by and large, those who go in the military had higher health status, both mental and physical. So there is something called healthy worker effect. So they are less likely to die from natural cause. And so it looks like they are dying more from suicide. But when you compare in terms of statistical terms with the general population, they are not more likely to die from suicide. We do know that post-traumatic stress disorder and being wounded in action are associated with the risk of suicide among Vietnam veterans. And I think that's going to be true for the current cohort of service members. And during the service and also after they get out. And those people who go in the VA, if you work in the VA, you know, they are usually from the socioeconomic status of a lower end, less resources, they have more health problems. So a VA treatment seeking population, there you find a significantly higher risk compared to the US general population with respect to suicide. But that's not what the VA is doing. I just want to make it clear. You know, it's the population who are coming into the VA. So now moving forward to the current statistics, OEF, OND and OEF, active duty in the veterans, and this one just came out from New York Times, and its sources are from the military documents. One thing I like about, it's funny to say, but one thing I like about the current military in reporting, even though it's really sad stories, they release them. They don't try to sweep it under the carpet. So we know very accurately what they know. That was not the case during the Vietnam. So you see that here, what the statistician called monotonic increase, it's just a gradually increasing suicide from 2002 to 2012. And the majority of those come from the increases in the suicide among the Army service members. So some of them have been released from the military duty or become veterans, but this is the death rate that they have now. So compare to that, Air Force and the Navy rate, even though they are increasing a little bit, it's not as high as the increase in the Army, but because there are more people in the Army. And the civilian rate, I don't know if I can point it out, it's about 18 to 19 per 100,000. So in terms of scale, I want you to just remember the scale is per 100,000. So the difference between 18 per 100,000 versus 25 per 100,000 is significantly different. So that's what we're seeing there. So this is useful information for current service members and the veterans. As in the case with the Vietnam veterans, the first 5 years are most risk period for suicide, and this is again per 100,000. The first 2 years, the suicide rate is 23, and the 2 to 4 years it goes down to 18, and after 6 years it's actually lower than the general population counterpart. So you can see whether it's a homicide or a vehicle accident or suicide, the first up to 5 years, and in the current generation even less than that. And that's the period where they're at high risk for various things, and we show information of what those various things are later on. So just to summarize, risk for suicide among OEF veterans is significantly higher, and Army admits that this time around. They said, yes, our suicide is higher, statistically higher than the civilian counterpart, and that difference is 5 of 100,000. And the previous slide shows you the risk appeared to be inversely related to the time lapse since separation from active military duty and the deployment. So this is where the issues in the reintegration comes in. So if they reintegrated well enough, then some of them could avoid being killed, killing somebody, or taking their own lives. Importantly, though, that military tells us, and I believe that, that half of suicide were not even related to deployment. To conflict reasons, they may be deployed to someone else, or they may not have been deployed and just in active duty military status. And we don't have a good answer for why that's happening. I don't want it to think this is epidemic of suicide among the military at this point, but this is kind of counterintuitive. And also what's important is half of them involve some sort of intimate relationship, girlfriend and boyfriend issues. And again, during the first 5 years, a lot of things going on, so some relationship issues could trigger a suicidal thought that could lead to suicide. So what is military doing? So this is a slide, very nice slide, continuity of care from readiness to prevention to intervention to treatment before the death occurs. Very nice to see, but actually it doesn't happen. The continuity of care is something in the sky. So in reality, I am saying, though, that awareness of suicide prevention has improved much better, but it's not like a systematic continuity of care, rather that each institution is doing their best to try to prevent suicides. Monica probably want to say something about it later. So improved screening for mental health, for depression, PTSD, and there is a massive effort to disseminate suicide hotline, both VA and the military. And within the VA, there's something called a PACT. That's basically an attempt to co-locate mental health professional with the primary care, because the primary care physician is usually the first one that the veterans and the service members go to. So if they are hooked up with mental health care, then the chances of detecting PTSD and the depression will be higher than otherwise. There are also suicide prevention effort, family support program, and the National Guard has strong bond programs. And the gatekeeper model, this is an idea of training the trainers. So the prevention filters through top to the bottom, and the Air Force has been successful. Currently, military is moving to holistic, comprehensive soldiers fitness program. And what that is they have the 5 pillars: emotional, behavioral, physical. And their idea is we just can't afford losing soldiers because there aren't enough in the current war. So there's multiple deployment issues. So to keep them healthy, the idea is very similar to obesity. To eradicate obesity, you can't just restrict the diet and let them go through yo-yo diet. So you have to change, for example, environment where healthy stores are. So military is moving to health promotion approach. And 3 years ago, even 3 years ago, when I hear a proposal got funded for yoga, I go like, what? Those Marines? They're going to do yoga? It turns out they love it. So that's part of the holistic approach. And for suicide prevention, I personally advocate means restriction. I know it's not going to work, at least in the United States, but basically firearm hygiene. We know this is a proven method to reduce suicide. Just how to do it, especially in the United States, is a huge problem. But military, especially for active duty military service members, there is a possibility to implement some sort of restriction measures, at least for those people who exhibit suicidal ideation. And that has a higher chance of working than, I would say, other things that we're trying to implement, at least for US service members. So I've talked about morbid stuff, death, suicide. So I want to be a little bit upbeat here. So what about people who were wounded? So this is where we have seen a lot of improvement. So the death rate among the wounded, among those with the physical injuries, 30% died in World War II, 24% in Vietnam, 9% in OEF. So that's a dramatic reduction in among those who did get wounded. So the reasons are usually technological, improved the body armor. So this guy up there, he is fully protected from top to the bottom. And the around the chest is like this. I've never worn this, you know. I'd love to wear that one of these days. And what's called MRAP, there's a heavy mine-resistant ambush-protected armored vehicle. And then there's one period during the Iraq War that service members complained there's not enough, so they get injured. So these are technological development. Military spend a lot of time, but that they save lives. This slide is a little bit difficult to see. It contrasts what happens with the wounded between Vietnam and the Iraq War. So the first things you notice is the differences in number. Here, wounded is over 300,000 during the Vietnam, but for, well, this one is Iraq only. It's about 22, less than 23,000. And then what you see here is those people who are wounded and has to be hospitalized at about half. And here, those people who are wounded but return to the duty is over half. So that tells you how rapidly they take care of the wounded. However, this slide is a little bit inconsistent in showing the ratio between the wounded to fatality rate. So there, I'm a little bit puzzled, but the improvement is very slight. So I think the reason is just in Vietnam, there are so many who were wounded, where in Iraq, the total number of wounded is relatively small in comparison. So that's why we see the ratio not being so different between the Vietnam and Iraq. So this is kind of visual portrait of what they used to get, now what they get. And so here, this is around 1862. So what they did was just to chop it off, just right in the ankle, just flatly go like this. And their prosthetic is basically the same thing as the shoes that you wear, has a little bit of cushion. And that was the technology they had 150 years ago. Now look at this. So, you see the smile face, he's got the new prosthetics, and this is computer controlled. So you can actually use your computer, even if you lose the whole arm, to actually manipulate the object. And that's a big difference. And you can do the motorcycling race. Remember, I don't know how many of you have seen the Forrest Gump. Lieutenant Dan, he started out with the wheelchair, and so this is a shrimp boat, and he was getting a little bit happy, and by the time Forrest Gump married, he came to the wedding with a prosthetic, with the pants on. And pants on means full-size pants on. So, he's going through it. And during that time, he had alcoholism and so on and so forth. But that's what the technology can do for you. It gives you mobility. And that is an area that has improved tremendously. So now I am going to a little bit more fuzzier area, what I call trauma spectrum disorder, or some people call it invisible wound. and that could include PTSD, traumatic brain injury, depression, some other things. So looking the consequences of trauma in terms of a spectrum disorders, there are a number of things, and we don't know why expressing in one way versus another, why some people have PTSD but not depression, or the relationship between the PTSD and the traumatic brain injury. But the cluster of a pathological development, PTSD, anxiety, depression, somatic dysfunctions, substance abuse, anger, violence, cognitive impairment is a big item because the normal society in the United States is very complex. You don't realize that, but think about the gadget you have to manipulate. How many gadgets you have? I only have 3, but I think it's too many. So cognitively, this is a very complex society. So if you have traumatic brain injury, then you have impaired cognitive capacity. It's a very different world when they come back. I am going to be talking only about the PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and it touches very briefly on the substance abuse for the sake of time, and move to reintegration. Okay, now first PTSD. So PTSD is what we consider a signature injury, and that has been the case for some time. Before the Vietnam, and this is railway spine, and that was before airplane was a common means for transportation, and that's what they called when people got in the train accident. Soldier exhaustion, those are 19th century terms. Shell shock, that's World War I. Battle fatigue, combat fatigue, so on and so forth. In World War II, Vietnam changed the terminology as well as the science. So DSM-2, I have actually not read the DSM-2. That was before 1980, specify what is now known as PTSD as a gross stress reaction. And the popular term for that is the Vietnam syndrome. And I already alluded to it. The contemporary terminology is post-traumatic stress disorder that was born in the 1980 with the revision of DSM. So at that time, it did become a true psychiatric diagnosis. Before that, people weren't really believing, and there's something there, but we don't know what it is. And so with the DSM-3's arrival, PTSD must meet explicit criteria, and that's different from acute stress disorder. For those of you who came back from the war zone or you got in an accident, for a while you feel jittery, you're hypervigilant, that's normal. That's normal reaction that we have in ourselves and in our DNA. So less than 1 month, don't worry about it. If it's longer than 1 month, maybe you start thinking about it. Maybe I'm not doing right. Okay, so I will lose my license in my department of psychiatry if I don't show you this slide. So what is the diagnostic criteria for PTSD? It runs through and through and through. You have to have a stressor. You can't just have depression-like symptoms without actual objective criteria of being exposed to trauma-like experience. In the DSM-4, you don't have to be really feeling horrified or overwhelmed. That subjective criteria is removed. And the 4 symptom criteria, that's same as the earlier versions: intrusion, avoidance, negative alteration in the cognitions and the mood, alterations in arousal and the reactivity, and the duration is more than 1 month. I personally think that the people who are really exhibiting chronic PTSD, they have gone through more than 1 month, and 1 month could still be considered the acute stress reaction, but that's my own opinion. You have to have a functional impairment. Even though you have nightmares, if you're functioning well, then you don't meet the PTSD criteria. And it's not due to medication, substance use, or other illnesses. I might actually skip this. So this is one of the best-known studies of Vietnam-era veterans. And back then, the rate of lifetime PTSD among male, 1 out of 3 were considered having the PTSD, and the female about the same rate. And at the time they were doing the study, 15% in males and 8.5% of female reported symptoms that would meet DSM criteria. And the previous slide has all this comorbidity, but I think for the interest of time, I'll skip that. Risk and the protective factors, and those are the factors that increases or decreases the rate of psychiatric syndromes. And this is in Vietnam. So the point is that after Vietnam, people put a lot of effort, and this is a congressionally mandated study, and they came up with a very good list of what are the protective factors, what are the risk factors. And when I look at them now, they're not all that different. Probably not Japanese American ethnicity anymore, but they're not all that different now. So the science and understanding of the causes of PTSD were laid out during the Vietnam War and then afterwards. What we have to do now is a prevention, treatment, and health promotion. Okay, now moving to OIF, OMD, OEF. Now remember the suicide chart. This looks almost like that. So it's a gradual increase of deployed people. And if you look at the non-deployed, the rate of PTSD is pretty much stable. So it's really the deployment is associated with the increase in the PTSD in the current generation. Where research in the PTSD has advanced during the last 15 years is really the biological mechanism of how PTSD comes about. And we still don't know the final answers. This is it. But we do have some ideas, and some of those are confirmed. One area is called HPA-X, and this is a very important the axis that help you deal with fight or flight situations. But to make a long story short, there's a cascade of hormone secretion, and if you're repeatedly exposed to traumatic situation or chronic stress, then you will have this sensitization of this axis so that tail end of cortisol secretion, for example, will be lower than if you didn't have exposure to traumatic events. So where does it get to? We don't quite know. The reason is that as a researcher, if you really wanted to study what happens with the traumatic exposure, you have to catch them before the trauma. Because this cascade reaction happens very quickly. You can do animal research, but the humans tend to be very difficult. If you want to study the war trauma consequence of that and the biological consequence of a war trauma, then you have to be with them all the time, and you have to have equipment to measure them. So we still don't have a conclusive evidence that this is a major reason for PTSD. And I don't think it's even it's even known that this will account for a large number of cases of PTSD. The other area is gene expression, and methylation is a mechanism where the DNA doesn't change, but the chemical will be covering the base pairs in the DNA strand, in that the expression of the genes changes. And sometimes it's inherited, sometimes it's not. The kind of like my old example was, when I was a kid in Japan, and we see those horror movies and all the horror movies, and women is assaulted and stabbed. The next day, her beautiful black hair changed to all white, and something has happened. The DNA doesn't change overnight. So that's kind of like a crude example of a methylation, and that shows up in the physical appearance. Most of the time, it's not that dramatic. So this one that you see is a gene called MAN2C1. And the axis there is number of potentially traumatic events that the people experienced. And then the log odds on the vertical is the probability of getting the PTSD, simplistically speaking. So as you have more trauma and the methylation indicator increases, in other words, something is happening even though the gene doesn't change, and you're more likely to get the PTSD. Again, this is one example where the science is making a difference. I don't think this helps treatment at this point, but the science is a very slow process. What we do today may not help you if you have a PTSD today, but may help you the future generation of people who suffer from PTSD. Treatment is another area where evidence-based PTSD treatment has expanded and now is well established. Cognitive behavior therapy has been around for some time, but we know it works. EMDR, I'm a little bit more questionable on that, but some people think this eye movement, something happens behind your eyes and it brings the memory or it allows you to focus, and some people report it actually works. You know the pharmacologic medication treatment, the SSRI. I personally think that I want to have my daughter take this medication if she has PTSD, but for some people it works. But the side effect is also bad. And the point is there is no magic bullet. You know, some will work for some people and other will work for some people, but there's enough evidence that these treatments are likely to work. So we do not have that evidence after Vietnam. All right, now moving to traumatic brain injury. Kurt Goldstein is probably one of the first people who coined the traumatic brain injury term. So, before Vietnam, did we know about this? Yes, we did. The famous word is shell shock. It was initially meant to be the nervous system damage after the concussion. So they had that terminology in the 1916, and during the war, British Army banned that word because they thought it was just too fuzzy a scientific concept. And there was a science article in 2008 which said the shell shock reconsidered. So there is something about the shell shock that overlaps between, that indicates overlap between the PTSD and the TBI. So I mentioned in 1942, after the effect of brain injury in the war, that was the first of the major writings that pinpointed traumatic brain injury. In Vietnam, I did not know about this, but there is a large registry established which tried to examine the long-term effect of brain injury. And it was difficult for me to understand exactly what they're doing. And the reason was, after turning the pages, I learned that the registry is created for people who had penetrating traumatic injury, meaning that something happened to scalp. And the little picture over there is not from the Vietnam veterans, but the famous case where the iron rod just went through the whole scalp and came out from the teeth. And he miraculously survived, by the way, and then got married and cognitively okay. So you can live even that bad stuff happens, but by and large it's more severe traumatic injury. And so the registry is about the people who had a severe traumatic brain injury, so the data are now really comparable. And that's what I learned after I read and then tried to figure out what can I compare. All right, so So currently, the definition of TBI is very well established, and you have to have external force. You just having the cognitive impairment doesn't count, and have to be struck by object and penetrating brain, so on and so forth, or brain having had some bruise and some other abnormalities due to movement. And that can happen with the blast and explosion because of the IED. The service members now are coming back with a lot of breast injuries and the TBI symptoms. There is a distinction between open and closed TBI. And open TBI is what you saw in the previous slide. Something happened to your scalp. Whereas a closed TBI, the outside is intact, but something happened inside the brain. And those are the most cases that we see in the current cohort. Sequela, those are physical, cognitive, and emotional expression due to TBI. And then there's a slew of symptoms, headache, nausea, vomiting, so on and so forth. I just listed them in case you're interested in it. Cognitive impairment, as I mentioned, is relatively serious in the advanced society. Emotional behavior, this is where the comorbidity between the PTSD and the TBI comes in. So how do you diagnose TBI? And it's as complicated as PTSD. So there is a distinction between mild, moderate, and the severe, but it combines several factors. So if I were a primary care physician, I would not going to be able to diagnose TBI patient. It's very complex diagnosis. So that involves loss of consciousness, alteration of consciousness or mental state, and post-traumatic amnesia, and something called the Glasgow Coma Scale, how long you were in a coma. Actually, I should say I had a motorcycle accident when I was 7, and my mother tells me I was not awake for 3 days. So that would put me in the very tail end, and gee, did I really have that? So in the current OEF, OND, OEF service members and the veterans, majority of the cases are mild TBI, which belongs to kind of the normal structure imaging, and the amnesia, for example, is less than 1 day. This is where people have trouble because the detection of mild TBI is not as easy. I'll show you what happens to the brain. Next, I'm sorry. So again, this figure looks very familiar to you. It looks like a suicide figure. It looks like PTSD figure. The mild TBI is where it's increasing, but yeah, there's no legend here. Somebody messed it up. Not me. So the mild TBI is what's increasing over time. And if you look at the moderate TBI and the severe TBI, that's very stable over time. And that could be due to detection, improvement in detection over time, or it could be that the war has gotten worse and the people are reporting more. We don't know. So what happens? And this is TBI 101, and you may know it already. So there are several kinds of what causes the TBI. COOP, this is very common in the civilian population. So the car accident, you go like this and go like this. So this has been known for some time. And acceleration and deceleration, that's very similar, but its impact in the lower part of the brain is supposed to be a little bit more severe. But basically, instead of going like this, it circles around. And the milder version of that is called the diffuse anoxal injury. And this one is the hardest to detect because what happened is there is a little bit of rotation in the brain, and where the damage occurs at the neuron level. So here's a neuron, and there's a nucleus here, and there's something called the axon, long tail of it. Because the brain rotates a little bit, the axon gets either broken, twisted, so that's the damage. So if you look at the brain image, I don't have it with me, it shows the specks of things. If you have ever had the mammogram and you're told you have ductal carcinoma in the sputum, and if you look at the image and you have those specks, it's like that. It's just specks of things that shows the damage in the axon. And with respect to other things, blood clot and swelling, you see the picture. This can be detected easily by CT. So what happened to mild TBI? This is an area that concerns you most if you went to the war this time around. So mild TBI, despite awful things people said, this is just for cognitive functioning, usually recovers very quickly, so don't worry about that. You know, of course, you should do rehabilitation, you should get some treatment, but the long-term prognosis is pretty good. Moderate TBI and severe TBIs, the prognosis is variable. Some people recover fast, and some other people, it takes a long time to recover. So, as for TBI, where we see the most advance in science, identification and a mapping of a closed form of TBI, those are usually mild and moderate TBI. So better identification with the imaging technique and something called the diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, that can now detect axonal injury. And my colleague David Brody published in the New England Journal of Medicine to show that the identification of this type of brain injury can be facilitated by using the DTI imaging technique. Treatment, so the long-term treatment of TBI, it's still kind of murky, in my opinion. There's areas of behavioral, cognitive, physical, those rehabilitation has to take in a different time period and depending on the symptom and depending on damage. So I think we still have somewhere to go. The rapidity of evacuation, and that's where the prognosis turns out to be a better, because you know, you're in the war field, and I think medevac takes about 30 hours from Iraq to either Germany or the Walter Reed. That could not have happened during the Vietnam. So the surgeon gets to the brain very rapidly, and the faster the better when you consider the swelling of brain, clot, so on and so forth. I don't know about axonal injury though. That I don't know enough about it. The other area is the public health. 10 years ago, I did not know about this, but now it's just like PTSD. People know about it, so the greater awareness within military and the veterans health providers and civilians. Now civilians are catching up and doing a lot of TBI research among the football players, high school students, and a vehicle accident. And also for veterans and military personnel, information is readily available with the improvement and vast expansion of internet information. All right, I don't have enough time, so I'm just going to touch on the substance abuse. I came into this field with the substance abuse among Vietnam veterans, so I can't just skip it. So among us, old-timers, when the Afghanistan war started, we are chatting it's going to be another Vietnam, meaning that there's going to be a diversion of opiates, and that's going to be filtered into the soldiers. That never happened, and I'm still wondering why it did not happen. So that's because in Vietnam, even though Vietnam itself was not a producer of opium, it was close to Golden Triangle, and I believe in the CIA conspiracy theory, but the route has changed once Vietnam War started. So the opium started coming into Vietnam. So that was one reason that the soldiers got addicted. There are other reasons, but in Afghanistan, Taliban essentially eradicated poppy production in 1999, and the success rate is 99%. Now comes U.S. military, and it went back. And opium producing in Afghanistan is as high as ever. However, our service members did not pick up a habit there, in part because of the, I think, intensive war training, so on and so forth. So that did not happen. So, excuse me. So what did happen? So compared to Vietnam veterans who are addicted to heroin and also they couldn't give up marijuana, we see no solid report on the diversion of opium, but the prescription drug use is on the rise. And some people believe that the alcohol abuse is also on the rise because in Iraq and Afghanistan, those are Islamic regions, so you don't drink. So when you come back, the first thing you do is pick up a glass of wine, and that becomes conditioning. And there is an element of iatrogenic epidemic of a pain medication use in the military, and I might say in the VA. The number of prescriptions they're writing in the VA is for the pain patients. When I say iatrogenic, it's a artificial epidemic, not natural in the sense people are using it for illicit reasons, but the physicians, pharmaceutical providers are producing more potent opium. And they're just, because this is a history museum. So that was the case about morphine around the turn of the century. And who were addicted? Those are the Southern housewives back then, more than a century ago. This time, service members and 2 decades ago, Vietnam veterans. Okay, so that's the area where a lot of research is going on right now. The other that I wanted to point out is, people talk about stigma, and we were talking about David Marsh yesterday, and stigma is still bad for psychiatric disorders, but it's almost the case that the soldier comes back and says, I have PTSD symptoms. It's acceptable. But that's not the case for illicit drug use or even alcohol in the military. Veterans Administration is different. So there's a considerable stigma attached so that people just don't go to seek help if you are still in the military and if you are trained in that culture. So I'm just going to touch upon integration effort with the Missouri National Guard. A number of people in the audience have helped initiate this research. So Missouri National Guard, the video that you're seeing, that was the Confederate. Missouri National Guard used to be militia, so that's the origin of Missouri National Guard. But the contemporary Missouri National Guard is given as much of a task as active duty military personnel without having the infrastructure like a base and a good training. So Missouri National Guard has about 100 units spread out, and they have been deployed to Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and some other regions. So they had, since 911, people don't realize, but they have had the same share of a burden as active duty component, and the service members themselves, when they enlisted in Missouri National Guard, may not have known that they're going to war. Post-deployment integration. So the concept of reintegration, it really encompasses not just the mental health or substance abuse prevention, but it really encompasses the areas of everyday life, just like us. So it could include employment, finance, housing, education, children, relationship, everything that you do. And they have to do that when they come back. But they have not had the infrastructure that allows you to make a smooth transition. So when I think about the U.S. institutions of a war in the military, there is something called the development defense. Its primary mission is to engage in wars. I mean, just too simplified, but so they have a rapid mechanism of deploying soldiers. If you look at the VA, they're supposed to take care of people who are coming back, but only those people who need health care. They're not designed to deploy rapid reintegration. So this is an area that kind of falls through a crack by default because we just don't have the institution. So Yellow Ribbon Program was mandated by law to create fill the void, so to speak. So in Vietnam, if you're Vietnam veterans, you may remember coming home and the next day, you're out of uniform, you go back to your parents' house or your girlfriend's house. So there's no transition period, and the exhibit that's associated with this has this quote: "We came home and we took all our uniforms and things and put it in the bag and left in the closet." And that actually describes what it was like for Vietnam veterans when they came home. Whereas in the current OEF, OND, and the OEF service members, they have wonderful ceremonies, welcome home. The situation has changed. The military is very serious about the reintegration. And that they emphasize the whole deployment cycle because 1/3 of service members will be deployed again. And that is known to be really bad in reintegration. And there has been massive public health campaigns in the various areas, and the Yellow Ribbon Reintegration Program is one of the major ones, which we have tried to evaluate. The other notion is family as a total package. They consider family as a unit. And we stole that title for our grant application. Thank you, thank you. And right now, I just want to emphasize, for those of you who are employers, the veterans coming back now, they need jobs for good reasons, and the economy is still bad. They are very well trained, and they are really, they work hard, and please do consider hiring veterans when they come home. And that's my political statement, not the science statement. So this is, we talked about the comprehensive warrior fitness, and these are the pillars: physical, emotional, social, family, spiritual. One thing that I do recommend, if you're one of those people who came back recently and feels a little bit of a void and have some issues, either traumatic brain injury, depression, and don't drink. I know that drinking would let you sleep, but this data shows that if you drink, and this is by Dr. Van den Berg-Clark, who is one of the postdocs, and if you drink, then you use that, and I think it's safe to say, you use that to take care of your problems, like sleeping, agitation, and you're less likely to go seek help. So in the long run, that's not good. All right, so I want to end, it's time, with my thanks to people who participated in 2 major studies that I've carried out. One is over 1,200 Vietnam veterans. We closed it out around 2007 finally. Those are initiated by late mentor Lee Robbins. I learned a lot from that. By the way, so here's me when I was still very young, and here's me, it's close to current age. And we also got help from over 2,000 Missouri National Guard service members and their supporters. This is one of the scenes from returning from Kosovo, and we appreciated their help. I also would like to thank you, Lee Robbins, I mentioned. She was the one who let me have the data set to start follow-up of Vietnam veterans. Edward Spitznagel, Keith Murray, Nathan Risk, and I think Greg Weiner is over there. He has been my security blanket for several years. And from the VA, Sis Eisen, Catherine Vergel, Bill True can come, and then Monica Matthews over there, who is a suicide prevention expert and a various consultant. And Gary Ryan was an anthropologist when I was doing the previous Vietnam study. And a number of Missouri National Guard members, Colonel Hagler, who was chief of staff at that time, and the Major Zimmerman, Lieutenant Kilmer, and Colonel Gary Gilmer, who actually joined yesterday's St. Louis on the Air, and Sergeant Laura Finn, Chaplain McGee, and other Yellow Ribbon operational team. And there are the photos. All right, so here one of them who went to war. And you know, you may still have the sense that you may feel that you're in Iraq, and if you have driven Humvee, you may have looked for a sniper. Here we are in Missouri now. So it looks almost identical, except you're not driving the Humvees. Welcome home. I just wanted to mention one more thing. Manan Shurov, who is in the audience, he spent hours and hours creating the collage that portrays the history of studies and portrays the war successions. So if you have another 5 minutes, take a look at it after this. So are there questions?
Time for questions.
Yes.
Is there any correlation between the number of times somebody was deployed and the suicide? Is that a factor?
We have the evidence of number of deployment in the PTSD, but the number of deployment in suicide, I don't think we have evidence for that. Yeah, in part because the number is relatively small still. And also, remember one slide, suicide happens in odd situations, even those people who are not deployed. If your service members have suicides, for example, or those people who are not deployed to conflict regions. So there's something else going on, and I don't think the field has definite answer for that. I think there was a New York Times article, military is doing a massive suicide study, one or two of them. Anyway, so one of them said deployment is not a main factor for suicide among military personnel in the current conflict. I don't believe that yet, but it may be. We don't have the answer yet. Any other questions? Yes.
There's been a lot more information about sexual assault in the military recently. Is there any way to figure out how that adds or changes the experience of trauma?
So I am not an expert in military sexual trauma. Rape and other sexual assaults have what we call the penetrance rate of the PTSD of about half. That means 1 out of 2 people who are sexually assaulted would have a PTSD. I was talking to Dan yesterday, and prevention is best because we know the consequence of it. Treatment, there are polytrauma treatment and a PTSD treatment, but I would like to see the policy changes for one, and also more effort in prevention, because we know that sexual trauma, whether it happens in the military or elsewhere, is bad. The consequences are just too bad. We know that. So the preventing sexual trauma, I think is the best strategy, in my opinion. I hope I answered your question.
Well, I just didn't know if we were able to pull out yet, like when we say trauma from the military,
right.
How much of that is exposure to war,
right.
And how much of that is interpersonal?
Right, so there's a reporting problems. A lot of sexual trauma are not reported. That's one. And secondly, in terms of numbers, female service members is about still 20%. So in terms of statistical analysis, we don't have a right identification and we don't have enough numbers. So that would make somebody like myself, epidemiologist, study sexual trauma in the quantitative statistical fashion. I think more smaller scale qualitative study for sexual trauma, I think will be more helpful for treatment modality as well as preventions for this particular topic.
Great.
Well, thanks for coming, and I hope you come back and enjoy the exhibit as well.